House and Land, by Alan Curnow is a poem that reflects on the theme of displacement and alienation in the context of colonial New Zealand. The poem begins by introducing Mrs. Felicity Stark, an old woman who lives on a once grand colonial estate, surrounded by vast, empty land. Curnow immediately sets the tone of the poem as one of desolation and nostalgia, depicting a landscape that is simultaneously beautiful and barren. The estate, once a symbol of prosperity and ambition, now feels empty and alien to Mrs. Stark. Mrs. Stark represents the colonial settler, but she is not at peace with the land she occupies. Her character is marked by a profound sense of alienation and disconnection from the land she has lived on for so many years. Despite her long residency, she remains a stranger in this environment, unable to connect with the natural world around her. Curnow uses Mrs. Stark's character to explore the emotional and psychological impact of colonialism, showing how settlers often failed to establish a meaningful relationship with the land they sought to possess. Her name, Felicity Stark, suggests an ironic contrast between the idea of happiness, felicity, and the harshness, stark, of her reality. Curnow delves into the history of Mrs. Stark's family, whose ancestors were some of the early European settlers in New Zealand. The land, originally wrested from the indigenous Maori people, now seems to resist the presence of the settlers. The grandeur of the colonial dream has faded, leaving behind a sense of disillusionment. The house, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now stands as a relic of a bygone era. The legacy of the colonial past weighs heavily on Mrs. Stark, as she contemplates the futility of her ancestors' efforts to tame the land. One of the key themes in the poem is Mrs. Stark's disconnection from the land, which has never truly become her home. Despite living there for many years, she has not developed an intimate relationship with the land. The land remains indifferent to her presence, and she feels as though she does not belong. This alienation from the land symbolizes the broader disconnection between colonial settlers and the natural environment in New Zealand. Nature plays a significant role in the poem, but it is not portrayed as a nurturing or welcoming force. Instead, the landscape is depicted as cold and unyielding, indifferent to human presence. The natural world seems vast and empty, with no sense of warmth or familiarity for Mrs. Stark. The poem's descriptions of the land emphasize its barrenness and isolation, which heighten the sense of alienation experienced by the characters. The natural environment is not something that Mrs. Stark can control or shape to her will. It remains distant and untamed. The passage of time is another central theme in the poem. Mrs. Stark reflects on the changes that have taken place over the years, both in the landscape and in her own life. The once thriving estate has fallen into decline, and the land around her has changed, becoming more wild and untamed. The poem suggests that time has eroded the ambitions of the settlers, leaving behind only remnants of their efforts to cultivate and control the land. Mrs. Stark's own life is similarly marked by decline. She is now old and isolated, with little connection to the world around her. Mrs. Stark's sense of isolation is inherited from the colonial experience, where settlers often found themselves cut off from their homelands and unable to fully integrate into the new environment. Curnow emphasizes that Mrs. Stark, despite her long residence in New Zealand, remains emotionally and culturally disconnected from the land. This isolation is not just personal, but also reflective of a broader historical and cultural experience of colonial displacement. The poem suggests that the colonial settlers, in their attempt to impose their will on the land, ultimately failed to create a lasting connection with it, leaving future generations, like Mrs. Stark, to inherit a legacy of alienation. Throughout the poem, Mrs. Stark is haunted by memories of the past. She nostalgically recalls the early days of her family's settlement, but these memories are tinged with sadness and regret. The sense of nostalgia in the poem reflects the broader theme of loss, as Mrs. Stark grapples with the realization that the colonial dream has not come to fruition. The memories of the past serve as a reminder of what has been lost, both in terms of the land's original state and the settlers' ambitions. Curnow uses memory as a way to explore the emotional complexities of colonial history, where the past is both idealized and mourned. The house in the poem is a powerful symbol of the colonial experience. Once a grand and imposing structure, it now stands as a dilapidated reminder of the past. The house represents the settlers' attempt to establish permanence and control over the land, but its current state of decay reflects the failure of that endeavor. The house, like Mrs. Stark, is a relic of a bygone era, out of place in the changing landscape. It symbolizes the fragility of human efforts to impose order on nature, as well as the transient nature of human ambition. The house's deterioration mirrors the broader decline of the colonial legacy, suggesting that the settlers' achievements were ultimately ephemeral. In the final lines of the poem, Curnow emphasizes the deep sense of alienation and displacement that defines Mrs. Stark's existence. She is not at home in the land where she lives, nor does she feel connected to the past that her house represents. The poem ends on a note of profound sadness, as Mrs. Stark is left isolated, unable to reconcile herself with the land or her own history. Curnow's portrayal of Mrs. Stark's alienation is emblematic of the broader colonial experience, where settlers, despite their efforts to control and possess the land, remain outsiders in a world that resists their presence.